The wire transfer was completed before they ever saw the house. George Turner sat at his kitchen table in Michigan, staring at the confirmation screen as the final message appeared. The funds had been sent. $280,000, nearly everything he and Elaine had saved for retirement, was now in someone else's account. The email reassured him that everything was in order. Closing would be finalized remotely. The home in Naples, Florida, was officially theirs. Elaine stood behind him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. She smiled, already imagining what life would look like in a place without snow, without long winters, without the constant feeling of waiting. "We finally did it," she said. For years they had talked about leaving Michigan behind. They had planned carefully, saved consistently, and avoided unnecessary risks. This move wasn't impulsive. It was the result of decades of work. The listing had seemed perfect from the beginning, a quiet home in a peaceful neighborhood, priced just below similar properties. Not suspiciously low, just enough to feel like an opportunity. The photos showed clean interiors, a well-kept yard, and sunlight coming through wide windows. It looked lived in, real, not staged. The seller explained in his first message that he needed to relocate quickly due to family issues. That detail made the price make sense. Communication started simply and then became consistent. The seller, who introduced himself as Daniel Reeves, replied quickly to every question. His tone was calm and professional. He provided documents when asked, including what appeared to be proof of ownership. Everything matched what George could find in public records. The name was correct, the address was correct, there were no obvious signs of anything unusual. When George suggested a phone call, Daniel explained that he was traveling and had unreliable reception. He preferred to keep everything in writing to avoid confusion. At the time, it didn't seem unreasonable. In fact, it felt organized. Every detail was written down, easy to review, easy to trust. A few days later, Daniel introduced a closing agent who would handle the transaction. The agent sent structured emails outlining each step. There were timelines, document requests, and clear instructions. It looked exactly like what George expected from a professional process. The paperwork arrived in clean, formatted files. Nothing looked rushed or incomplete. George read everything carefully. He wasn't careless. He double-checked names, compared details, and even looked up the property multiple times. Every check confirmed the same thing. The house existed, and the seller's name matched the records. The only thing he couldn't verify was the person behind the emails. As the process moved forward, the closing agent explained that the final step would be a wire transfer. This was standard for cash purchases. The instructions were precise, including bank details and reference numbers. George hesitated briefly, but everything else had checked out. There was no reason, at least on the surface, to stop. He sent the money. Within hours, he received confirmation that the process was complete. The home was now theirs. Final paperwork would be mailed. Keys would be arranged upon arrival. For the first time in years, George felt a sense of completion. The plan had worked. 3 weeks later, they packed their belongings into a moving truck and began the drive to Florida. The trip felt different from any they had taken before. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't a visit. It was the beginning of something permanent. Elaine talked about where she would place furniture, how she would set up the kitchen, what plants she might grow outside. George listened, occasionally adding his own thoughts, but mostly just feeling satisfied that they had reached this point. When they finally entered Naples, the air felt warmer, softer. The roads were lined with palm trees, and everything looked exactly as they had imagined. But that feeling didn't last. As they turned onto the street where the house was located, George slowed the truck. He checked the address again, then looked at the house. "There's a car in the driveway," he said quietly. Elaine leaned forward. Maybe someone's inside cleaning or finishing up. It was a reasonable explanation. It had to be. They parked and walked up to the front door. George knocked. A few seconds passed, then the door opened. A woman stood there, looking at them with clear confusion. "Can I help you?" she asked. George hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to explain.
"We're here for the house. We just bought it." The woman's expression didn't change. "No, you didn't." The words landed harder than anything else could have. Elaine stepped forward. "We completed everything. The closing, the payment. This is our address." The woman shook her head slowly. "I've lived here for 10 years. I never sold my house." The conversation that followed didn't resolve anything. George showed documents. The woman showed hers. Both sides had paperwork. Only one side had reality. Within an hour, police arrived. Officers reviewed the situation carefully. They spoke to both parties, examined identification, and looked at the documents George had brought. Everything George looked at looked real, but it didn't match the actual ownership of the home. One officer explained it clearly. "This appears to be a real estate scam. Someone likely used a fake identity to sell you a property they didn't own." George felt his chest tighten. "We sent everything." The officer nodded. "You authorized the transfer. You need to contact your bank immediately." George already knew what that meant. The money was gone. The scam had been designed to work exactly like this. The man behind it, Daniel Reeves, didn't exist. The name had been taken from public records. The real homeowner's identity had been copied just enough to create credibility. The listing itself was a duplicate of a real property, slightly modified and reposted on a different platform. Everything George had verified was technically correct. That was the key. The information wasn't fake. The person using it was. The closing agent was also part of the operation. Emails were structured to look professional. Documents were formatted to appear legitimate. Every step was designed to remove doubt and replace it with routine. By the time George sent the wire transfer, there was no visible reason not to trust the process. Once the money moved, it was split across multiple accounts within hours. Some of it was transferred again, some withdrawn, some moved internationally. The speed was intentional. It made recovery nearly impossible. Back in Naples, George and Elaine sat in their truck, parked across the street from the house they thought they owned. The homeowner had gone back inside. The officers had left after advising them on next steps. Nothing had changed, except everything. Elaine stared ahead, saying nothing. George held the steering wheel, replaying every moment leading up to that day. "We checked everything," he said quietly. Elaine nodded, but it didn't help. They contacted their bank. A report was filed, but the response was immediate and limited. The transfer had been authorized. The funds had already moved. Recovery would be difficult. They filed police reports, spoke to investigators, and contacted federal authorities. Each step confirmed the same reality. The transaction had been built to look real, and it had worked. Days turned into weeks as they tried to understand what had happened. Investigators traced parts of the money flow, but the trail broke quickly. Accounts were closed, names led to nowhere. The person behind it had planned every step to avoid being found. The homeowner, caught in the middle, offered sympathy but could do nothing. The house had never been for sale. George and Elaine had purchased something that didn't exist. The emotional impact stayed with them long after the facts were clear. The future they had planned disappeared in a single transaction. Every decision they made afterwards was shaped by that moment. Months later, there was still no resolution, no arrest, no recovery. George opened his laptop one evening and read through the original emails again. The listing, the messages, the instructions, they all looked the same as they had before. Clean, professional, convincing. He closed the screen slowly. It had started with one transfer, and by the time they reached the front door, there had never been anything waiting for them at all.